Hi there, it's Steven, and I wanted to make a helpful video about how to set up SSO with an Onspring instance. I've done this a handful of times, and I thought it would be helpful for other admins or other people that deal with identity providers and setting up these SSO integrations, just to have as a point of reference of how someone does it or how someone approaches doing it. So that's what I'm going to walk through today. So here I'm at my login page for my Onspring instance. This is the local login page. And so what I want to do today is I want to set things up so that when I visit this instance, instead of seeing this local login page, I'll be redirected to my identity provider, which in this case is going to be Azure AD. And then once I log in successfully in Azure AD, I can then be sent back to my Onspring instance to actually get into the instance and do the work. And that's really just kind of going to make my life easier to not have to manage another set of local credentials. I can just rely on a kind of a centralized set of credentials that and let my identity provider take care of the authentication into all these different, whether that be multiple Onspring instances or other web applications or non-web applications. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to log into the instance locally really quick because I want to kind of point you in the right direction if you actually want to go to like the official Onspring documentation on single sign-on. I'm not going to walk through that documentation today for the purpose of just brevity and video length. But if you do want to kind of reference the official Onspring SSO documentation, the best place to go to is the Help Center. And what I usually do is I just search for SSO, which should bring up the Understand Single Sign-On Help Center topic. And this topic has all the best resources. So it'll walk you through kind of the process, what's needed, give you as the Onspring admin, as well as maybe you're not also the person who oversees the IDP or has control of the IDP. So it'll give that person an overview of the process and what they need. There's also this really helpful SSO guide, which walks you through basically all kind of gives you like a checklist of how to set this up for SAML, how to set this up for Azure AD. If you're using something more like a legacy infrastructure like AD Active Directory Federation services, if you want to use WS Fed, it walks you through all these different configurations. It talks about SSO auto provisioning, which Onspring has this feature. You know, if you're familiar with just-in-time provisioning, that allows a user to sign in through your identity provider, and if they don't have an account in Onspring, they can be automatically logged in. Again, this document just has a wealth of information. So if you want some official documentation beyond just kind of me walking through this or demonstrating how I set this up, this is where I would go. One thing I will point out is you will need to work with Onspring support directly to kind of finalize the integration. So once you get things set up at the identity provider, you will have to work with Onspring support so that they can set things up on the back end correctly. So your identity provider and your instance talk to each other correctly. So that's something to point out. This isn't sort of a thing you can do just yourself in a silo. You will have to work directly with Onspring to kind of put the cap on things, so to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And I'm going to go ahead and navigate to my user profile because really quick, I want to just kind of set the stage for what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and head over to my user profile here. And in Onspring, we have some fields that are important in the users app when we're discussing SSO, because in order for Onspring to properly authenticate, a user and handle that user's authentication properly, there's some fields, there's some information that we need to configure our identity provider to pass back to Onspring. And so the most important ones are actually the 4 that are required. So if you don't pass this information back from your identity provider in your SSO claim, things won't work properly. So I'm just going to point those out. So let me draw on the screen a little bit. So the first one is you're going to need a first name attribute in your, let me draw that a little bit better. You're going to need a first name attribute in your SSO claim that comes back. And Onspring is going to map that first name attribute from your identity provider to the first name field in your users app. That applies to the last name field as well. It applies to the username field, And so the username field is going to come from an attribute in your SSO claim called NameID. That's a very common claim to send, especially when you're dealing with the SAML protocol. A lot of identity providers might call it by different things. I think Azure calls it like a unique user identifier or something of the sort. But you have to provide that claim back. And then the last one is an email address. Those four all have to be sent back in the SSO claim in order for Onspring to be able to make sure the user one is authenticated correctly, and then make sure that the user gets put in the right Onspring account, or an account gets properly created for them if you're using that just-in-time provisioning feature. So let's go ahead and navigate away from Onspring for a second, and let's head over to Azure and get this set up. So in Azure, you're going to want to go to Azure Active Directory, and I'm in the Azure portal. And what I'm going to do here is in my Active Directory, I'm going to add a new enterprise application. And I've done this several times before, so you're going to see kind of a listing of all the different applications I've set up in the past. But I'm going to go ahead and add a new application. And I'm going to choose to create my own. So Onspring doesn't have any kind of like pre-configured or pre-built enterprise application you can register through the portal here. You have to go ahead and create your own application. So it's going to be essentially sort of a custom application. And I'm just going to enter a name for the application. In this case, I'm just going to call it Onspring instance. And I'm going to set it up to integrate any other application you don't find in the gallery. So like I was saying, Onspring doesn't have an existing one that's in this gallery, in this Azure AD gallery. So I'm just going to pick that bottom option there. I'm going to go ahead and click create. And then once I have created the application, may take a moment here, but once it's created, it's going to bring me up a page that allows me to administrate this application. It's still working here. All right, so it added the application Onspring instance added successfully. Great. So now we're going to go back to my enterprise applications. I'm going to search for Onspring instance. And there it is. That's the one I just created. And I'm going to open up this enterprise application, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to set up my single sign-on. So I'm going to pick the SAML option here. And then this is where you're going to do some of this configuration at the identity provider. And in this case, I'm going to first do the kind of the basic SAML configuration here. So to set this up for basic SAML, I need to provide an entity ID, which in Onspring's case, this is actually going to be the URL of your Onspring instance. So I'm going to go ahead and put in here helpful admin.onspring.com, and notice you do have to put the HTTP protocol in front of that URL or it won't work right. So make sure you do that. And then down here, I need to add the reply URL. So this is the URL that you're going to send your user back to on the Onspring side. So this is the URL that Onspring expects to receive the SSO claim to. So in this case, and this is the case for every Onspring instance, and this is covered in the Onspring SSO documentation. I know it off the top of my head because I've done it so many times, but it's going to be your Onspring instance URL followed by public federated login callback. And so that's the URL. Whenever I successfully authenticate here at Azure, I want Azure to send my SSO claim back to that endpoint. Okay, so that's the information I need there. So I'm going to save that. And then you remember I talked about needing to make sure that in my SSO claim, I include some basic claims information about first name, last name, email, and username. So down here in Azure, I have this option to set some attributes. And some claims. And you can see some have already been populated for me, and a lot of them are cover the ones I need. So we've got given name as a claim, which is going to be my first name. Azure uses a little bit different terminology than first name last name, but in Azure these are kind of the same thing. So given name maps to the first name field in Onspring. The surname claim is going to map to the last name field in Onspring. The email address is going to map to the email address in Onspring. The unique user identifier right here is the NameID attribute I talked about, and that's going to map to the username for the user in Onspring. Now, if you want to be really explicit about this, you could go in here and edit these claims, and you could change the name of the claim to be, well, not in this case, this one is the NameID, so I can't change that. But I can change some of these additional claims down here. So if I wanted this to be very explicit and call this email, I could. And if I wanted to go here and change this, and actually I'm just going to do that just for being very explicit, I could change this to email. I could change this to be first name. Oops. I could change this to be last name. And actually I'm gonna remove that namespace value too from all these. Just so it's very, very clear. This is going to be last name. Oh, did I already set a last name? Hold on. Oh, yep, I renamed this. So this should be, actually this claim, I don't need this claim. I can delete that claim. Okay, so this will be last name. Remove this and save. Okay, so now I have all my claims set up. So I've got my NameID claim, my email claim, my first name claim, and my last name claim. And again, the NameID claim is going to be mapped to the user's name field in Onspring. The email claim is going to be mapped to the email address in Onspring. The first name claim is going to be mapped to the first name field in Onspring, and the last name claim is going to be mapped to the last name field in Onspring. I know that seems kind of very explicit, but I just to kind of make it clear. And then the values, right? The value field is telling you where Microsoft or where Azure is going to pull the value to pass for that claim, right? So in this case, it's going to go to, let's say, the NameID. It's going to go to my user profile or my user's profile in Azure, and it's going to get the email address, and it's going to pass the email address as the NameID value. And for the email claim, it's going to use the user's email address again. And then for the first name claim, it's going to pass the user's given name, which is the user's first name. And those values, or what you pass for those values, can be changed. You can set that. Again, this is not a video about administrating Microsoft Azure or Azure AD. So I won't dive into that too much, but you do have control of what you send over, right? And whatever you send over, Onspring is going to use. So now that I have that all set up, we can head back to, what do I want to do? I want to head back to my, I want to head back to my Onspring instance app that I just made. Oh man, here we go. I want to head back to my enterprise applications. I want to find that Onspring instance app I registered. Okay, I'm back here on my single sign-on setup. So here I've got my claim set up. I've got my entity ID entered. I've got my reply URL. So I've got everything I need. Now at this stage, this is where kind of the configuration at the identity provider is complete. And so what I need to do is I need to pass some information to Onspring, the support team at Onspring, and they're going to use that information to kind of tie things together on their side. And the easiest way to do that is just to pull the metadata that your identity provider generates for the application you've configured. So in the case of Azure, I can just go ahead and download this metadata, this XML file, and then I can save that, and then I could shoot that off in an email to Onspring support and request that they set up SSO for my instance. And in this case, we're going to pretend that I've already done that, in that I've communicated with Onspring support and they've set things up on their side. And so now what we can do is we can actually test that the integration is working. Let me head over to my Onspring instance, and I'm already logged in. So let me log out. And if you remember, when I used to visit my Onspring instance, I would be shown my local login page. So now what I want to do is I want to attempt to log in, and what my hope is that I'm going to be redirected to Active Directory or Microsoft's login page to authenticate, and then when I successfully authenticate there, I'll be redirected back to my Onspring instance and be logged into the same account, and everything will work perfectly fine. So let me go ahead and log in. Great, so it works. So Onspring support took my metadata, they set things up correctly, took the pieces of information they needed to configure their side of the integration, and so now at least the redirect, the initial redirect, is working properly. So I've been sent from my local Onspring instance, I've been redirected to Azure to authenticate, and then when I successfully authenticate here, I want to be directed back to my Onspring instance. So let me go ahead and log into my Microsoft account. Oh, so this is a common thing. I wanted to kind of show some real life, issues that you can run into when you're setting up this configuration here. And this is one that you can run into with any identity provider. So in this case, this is not an Onspring issue. This is a Azure AD issue. This is how I've configured things at the identity provider. I've got a problem with how I set up that Onspring instance application in Azure. And it gives me a pretty good error message here. It says your administrator has configured the application Onspring instance to block users unless they are specifically granted assigned access to the application. So this is a feature in Azure where once you've registered an application to use in Azure AD, and you've configured single sign-on, you can control who in your directory can actually sign into that application using Azure AD by limiting it to only a group of users or specific users. So you actually have to go into Azure AD and provide users or people in your directory access to this application that you've configured. So if I go down here to users and groups, I can add a user, and I'm going to go ahead and select my user or my account here in my directory. I'm going to assign it. And so now when I try to go to my instance again, I should be redirected, right? So I tried to navigate to my Onspring instance. I'm redirected to Azure or Microsoft to log in. I'll go ahead and try to log into my account. And now what I expect is my login to be successful, and now here I'm back in my Onspring instance. However, you can see my view is not the same. My view is showing me no dashboards. I don't have any roles. I can't get to my admin panel. And that's because what happened, and this is very common, people encounter this with this SSO integration, I think pretty commonly, is that when I went to sign in with my Azure AD credentials, Azure AD sent back a SSO claim to Onspring, and that SSO claim had that NameID value in it. And that NameID value was my email address. So if I look at, I don't even think I can see I don't even have access to see my email address. But what it sent back was, instead of it sending back the proper username for my existing Onspring account, it sent back an email address that didn't match any existing usernames in Onspring. So Onspring just went ahead and provisioned me a brand new account, but this account doesn't have any access and it's not a system administrator. So what I want to do is I need to set up my claims in Azure to pass back the right value. So let's go back to Azure, and let's go back to the single sign-on page here. And let's edit this attributes and claims. So the one I care about is this unique user identifier, the NameID claim. right now it's passing the email address. So that's what Onspring's using as my username value in Onspring. But what it needs to pass is it actually needs to pass my first name, because my system admin account in that instance, the username for that account is my first name. So what I need to do is I need to go into this claim and I need to modify it so that instead of it using this email address identifier format, we're going to say it's unspecified, and then we're going to change the source attribute to be my given name, which is my first name, Stephen. So let me go ahead and save that. Okay, so that's changed there. So now I'm going to go ahead and log out of Onspring. So right now I'm logged into Onspring, but I'm logged into the wrong account. I'm logged into an account that Onspring created for me because I sent back in my SSO claim the wrong username value. So let me go ahead and log out. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in again, right? So I'm going to be sent back to Microsoft to authenticate. And I'm going to authenticate using the same set of credentials that I was using previously. But now what should happen is Azure, instead of sending my email back for my username, it should send my first name back for my username value. And so when Onspring receives Stephen for username, it should find in my existing account, my existing system administrator account, and it'll stick me into that account. So let me go ahead and log in again. And now I'm back in the right profile. You'll see here I've got the helpful admin profile icon here. And if I go to my user record, I've got all the right information. And interestingly enough, if I were to go poke around in my users app, so if I was to do a quick search here for that email address, we're going to find that there's two accounts here that are set up for me. One is my correct one, and one is the one Onspring made for me when I logged in through Azure and sent back the wrong username value. So let's see which one this one. This one is, okay, so this one is the wrong one, right? So this is the one that Onspring made for me that doesn't have any access. It doesn't have any roles or anything. And I can tell that because you can see the username value here. That username value is the unique user identifier value from Azure. It's kind of the default way to identify a user in Azure AD. And the other one is the correct one, which uses my first name as my username, which is just Stephen. And again, here, this is kind of just kind of real world issues that you can run into when you're setting up the SSO integration and you're going to test it. Is one, you might commonly run into that you might have set everything up correctly for your side of the configuration at the identity provider, but you may not have given users access to that application in Azure AD. So when they sign in through Azure, Azure blocks them from getting into the application because they need access in Azure to that application that they're signing into too. The other common one is this having users sign in through Azure, but when they come back to Onspring, they're in the wrong account. And that is most commonly caused by the fact that Azure is passing back a value for their username that doesn't line up with their existing account's username. And that can be fixed in a couple different ways. You can just change the username in Onspring so that it does match what Azure is sending, or you can change it on the identity provider side, or in this case, Azure side, and just modify the value that's being sent in that user's claim. Either one will work. You just have to make sure that NameID value that's sent in your SSO claim lines up with the existing user's username value in Onspring. Okay, I know this is a long one, almost half an hour video, 20-minute video, but I hope it was helpful to kind of watch somebody walk through this, how they set it up in an identity provider, the claims that are required, some of the common gotchas that you can run into when you're doing the testing of the integration once Onspring supports kind of finalized their piece. And of course, like I said, if you want some more official documentation, you can always go to the Help Center and look at that SSO documentation there. And of course, OnSpring support is always there to help. Definitely reach. You'll have to reach out to them to get the integration in place. But obviously, if you have questions, they're a great place to start if there's things that you need answers to. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, any comments, please leave them down below. I'll be happy to address them. Um, and I will see you in the next one.